It was a warm Saturday afternoon in June of 2002, when laughter echoed through the neighborhood park and the smell of fresh-cut grass still lingered after the final whistle of the youth soccer match. 11-year-old Ethan Torres, wearing his bright red jersey, had just scored the winning goal for his team. His parents cheered from the sidelines, his friends celebrated around him, and his dog, Max, waited loyally by the fence. But what started as a joyful day turned into a nightmare that shattered an entire community, because after that game, Ethan vanished. One moment he was surrounded by life, the next he was gone, leaving behind only confusion, silence, and a trail that went cold within days. The search was exhaustive. Volunteers combed the woods. Police questioned everyone at the field. Helicopters hovered. Flyers were posted on every lamppost and door. But no clue ever surfaced. Time passed, and with it, hope began to fade. The case remained open but untouched, gathering dust in a locked cabinet that no one wanted to open again. Ethan became a whisper, a name that echoed occasionally in church prayers or in the eyes of his grieving parents as they walked their now aging golden retriever, Max, around the block each evening. For over a decade, life tried to return to normal. Seasons changed. New families moved into the neighborhood. The soccer field was repainted and memories blurred. But Max never stopped returning to the same spot, just behind the bleachers, where he had last seen Ethan. Every year, on the anniversary, he would whimper and dig at the ground, only to be gently pulled away. It was painful, uncanny even, and always dismissed as canine confusion or longing. Until one fall morning in 2014, when Max refused to be stopped. That morning, the old dog's paws struck something hard beneath the earth. Buried beneath leaves and years of silence, he unearthed a small metal box, rusted, dented, but unmistakably out of place. Inside was a folded piece of paper sealed in plastic, and the moment Ethan's father opened it, his hands trembled. There, written in a child's handwriting, was a message that began with the words, "If you're reading this, I'm sorry I ran." The mystery they had buried along with their hope was suddenly alive again. What Max uncovered that day wasn't just a clue. It was the beginning of a truth darker and deeper than anyone imagined. Because what Ethan left behind wasn't just a goodbye. It was a breadcrumb to something no one in that quiet town was prepared to face. And as the story unfolds, you'll realize that sometimes the past isn't lost. It's simply waiting to be unearthed. The letter found inside the rusted metal box was old, its ink slightly faded but still legible. It was clear that a child had written it, filled with small spelling errors and uneven lines, as though written in haste and fear. The opening sentence, "If you're reading this, I'm sorry I ran," rattled Ethan's parents to their core. They had believed for 12 years that he had been taken, perhaps harmed, maybe even worse. But this message changed everything. The very idea that Ethan might have left on his own shattered the narrative they had clung to for over a decade. As the police took the letter into custody for analysis, whispers began to circulate. What could have made an 11-year-old boy run away on what should have been one of the happiest days of his life? The town, which had long buried its heartbreak under years of forgetfulness, now stirred with new questions. Was there something happening in Ethan's life that no one saw? Something dark? And why was the letter buried, deliberately hidden, in the same park where he disappeared? For Ethan's mother, Julia, the letter brought back memories she had buried with equal care. She remembered a moment, just 2 weeks before Ethan vanished, when he came to her room in the middle of the night, eyes wide with something she didn't understand. He didn't say much, just asked if monsters could look like people. She had brushed it off, thinking it was just a bad dream. A child's imagination playing tricks in the dark. Now, she couldn't stop replaying that moment over and over. The handwriting in the letter matched Ethan's school journals exactly. It wasn't a forgery, and the forensic team confirmed that the paper and ink dated back to the early 2000s. The box itself was a standard tin lunchbox, one Ethan had used during his 3rd grade year. It had been missing from his room, but no one had thought to ask about it at the time. It was a subtle piece of evidence that had gone unnoticed, like a whisper in a thunderstorm. Detectives reopened the case with new urgency, starting with the final hours before Ethan disappeared. His soccer coach was questioned again. So were his teammates. But all their memories were clouded by time. What remained consistent, though, was one name: Mr. Halbridge, the janitor at the sports complex. He had been the last adult seen near Ethan that day, but his involvement was dismissed early on due to a lack of evidence. Now, with the letter in hand, authorities wanted to know what secrets Mr. Halbridge might have kept for 12 years. Mr. Halbridge had long since retired. Now in his 70s, he lived alone in a cabin just outside town, far from the buzzing curiosity that was beginning to grip the community once again. When investigators arrived, he seemed calm. Too calm, perhaps. He admitted to remembering Ethan, said he was a bright kid with a lot on his mind. When asked to elaborate, he paused. "Some children carry more than we think," he said, his voice hollow. "But the truth is, sometimes the adults around them are the real weight." The detectives pressed him about the day Ethan vanished. Mr. Halbridge's memory was surprisingly detailed for a man his age. He remembered Ethan staying behind after the game, lingering near the back of the storage shed. According to him, Ethan had been looking for something, or someone. He kept glancing around like he was expecting someone else to show up, Halbridge said. But when asked who that could be, the old man grew silent. He didn't deny seeing Ethan last. He simply refused to say more. Meanwhile, the contents of the letter were slowly being decoded. It wasn't just a note. It was a trail. Ethan had included small references to places only he and his parents would recognize. The house with the tree that leans like it's tired, where the rocks are sharp and the water's always cold. And finally, the place where secrets go to sleep. These weren't just poetic fragments. They were locations from his childhood, his hideouts, his safe spaces. And the last line, "I buried it all where Max knows to dig." That final clue pushed investigators to search the park more thoroughly, especially around the area where Max had unearthed the box. With ground-penetrating radar, they uncovered a second object buried deeper, an old cassette recorder, wrapped in plastic, long dead but intact. The forensics team worked day and night to retrieve any surviving audio. And when they did, the chilling sound of Ethan's voice echoed through the speakers. "If this stops playing," the tape began, "it means someone found it. I hope it's not him." The town that had once pitied the Torres family now watched in collective silence. What began as a story of loss was evolving into something far more twisted. Ethan's voice on the tape hinted at a predator, someone he feared so much he chose to disappear instead of speaking up. But who was him? And how had this terror gone unnoticed for so long? The puzzle was just beginning, and every piece revealed made the picture darker. The audio continued with Ethan whispering into the recorder, as though he feared being overheard. "I know people think he's nice. He always brings candy. But I saw what he did. I saw what he said he'd do to me if I told." The trembling in his voice was undeniable. He went on to describe a man who knew how to act differently when others were watching, someone who volunteered at community events and was trusted by parents. "He smiles at everyone," Ethan said, "but when we're alone, his eyes change. He becomes someone else." Investigators cross-referenced this new information with everyone involved in the soccer club, especially those with a history of volunteering. The list was long, dozens of people who had helped over the years, but one name stood out, not because of a criminal record, but because of how often he appeared in Ethan's life. Jonathan Marsh, a youth mentor who worked at the local library and occasionally helped with the sports programs. He had a spotless record and had even been awarded for his work with children. But his presence was frequent, too frequent. Julia remembered Jonathan. In fact, she had once trusted him deeply. He'd tutored Ethan in reading when her son struggled in school, and often gave him rides home when practices ran late. At the time, she was grateful. Looking back, she recalled how Ethan had slowly begun to withdraw, not just from his friends, but from his family. He grew quiet, jumpy, afraid of going to certain places alone. It was subtle, but now, every sign seemed like a silent scream they had failed to hear. When authorities approached Jonathan for questioning, he was cooperative, smiling, calm, and even surprised that he was being mentioned in the case. He claimed he hadn't seen Ethan that day at all, and that his involvement with the soccer team was minimal. But investigators were growing suspicious. His alibis were vague, and while no direct evidence tied him to the disappearance, the pieces were beginning to align. especially when forensics revealed faint fingerprints on the plastic that wrapped the cassette recorder, one of which matched Jonathan Marsh. Still, the law required more than suspicion and one partial print. The police turned to Ethan's letter and audio for further clues. Both hinted at a place, a hiding spot known only to Ethan. Detectives, along with Max, returned to the place where secrets go to sleep. It was a trail near the lake, where Ethan and his father once built a makeshift fort out of branches and tarps. As they dug beneath the rotting fabric of that shelter, they uncovered a child's backpack, untouched since 2002. Inside were drawings, a flashlight, a broken watch, and a photo that made everyone freeze in place. In the photograph, Ethan was smiling, but not in the joyful way children do when they're happy. It was a tight, forced smile, and beside him stood Jonathan Marsh with a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. They were in the woods, and from the background, it was clear the photo had been taken near the same fort where the bag was found. The image hadn't aged well. The colors were faded and the edges bent, but the unease it carried was undeniable. What disturbed investigators most wasn't just Jonathan's presence. It was the fact that the photo hadn't been taken by Ethan's family. So who held the camera? This discovery pushed authorities to secure a warrant for Jonathan's property. What they found inside his basement shocked even the most seasoned officers. Dozens of VHS tapes, meticulously labeled with years and locations, most of them matching community centers, schools, parks, and camps. Some of the tapes were damaged, others blank, but a few contained footage that confirmed the worst. Children being filmed without consent, often in locker rooms or isolated areas. While Ethan didn't appear in those specific tapes, the pattern was clear. Jonathan had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Word spread fast. News vans returned to the town. Reporters camped outside the Torres home. But Julia and her husband refused interviews. They sat in silence, staring at the items from the backpack now laid out on their dining table. Ethan had tried to leave them breadcrumbs, and now each object felt like a message from a frightened boy who never stopped trying to be found. The broken watch, for instance, had stopped at exactly 4:17 in the afternoon, the time Ethan had last been seen at the park. Then came another breakthrough. One of the library volunteers stepped forward after seeing Jonathan on the news. She remembered something odd from years earlier, a small locked room in the library's basement, which Jonathan had always said was for storage. The police investigated immediately. Inside, behind a false wall, they discovered a tiny space no bigger than a closet. There were blankets, empty snack wrappers, a flashlight, and taped to the wall was a single sheet of notebook paper that read, "Almost safe, but not yet." The implications were chilling. Ethan had likely been hiding there at some point. Maybe not for long, but long enough to feel the need to leave a message. As the investigation expanded, a disturbing possibility took hold. Ethan hadn't just vanished that day. He had run, hid, watched, and possibly even returned to places where no one thought to look. His disappearance was never about getting lost. It was about escaping something or someone. And maybe, just maybe, he had left behind more than letters. Maybe he was still out there, watching, waiting. Investigators pored over every inch of the hidden room beneath the library, desperate to extract anything Ethan may have left behind. They found a pencil wedged behind a loose brick, chewed down to its stub, and a paper clip bent into the shape of a small hook. Both insignificant to the untrained eye, but to the behavioral analyst brought in for the case, they were survival tools. This wasn't just a place of refuge. It was a place of planning. Ethan had not merely run. He had prepared. Each object, each mark on the wall, suggested a boy who had lived in fear, but who refused to be helpless. One of the analysts theorized that Ethan may have been coming and going from this hideout during the early days of his disappearance. That perhaps he wasn't far away at all, but living on the edge of society, surviving in the shadows of familiar places. The more they studied the note, almost safe, but not yet, the more it sounded like a strategy. And that strategy may have been interrupted, possibly by someone discovering his location or betraying him. Back at the Torres home, Julia remembered a second incident that had once seemed minor. A week after Ethan vanished, their front door was found slightly ajar early in the morning. Nothing was taken, and there was no sign of forced entry. They had dismissed it as forgetfulness in their grief-stricken haze. But now, they wondered, had Ethan tried to return home? Had he stood in that doorway, watched his parents sleeping, and decided it was still too dangerous? The emotional weight of this possibility crushed Julia. She imagined her son, dirty and alone, peeking through the windows of his own home, heart pounding, desperate to feel safe again. Had he seen lights on? Heard them crying? Had he reached out and pulled back at the last second? If so, how many times? How many near encounters had they unknowingly missed while they clung to cold case theories and televised appeals? Then came the phone call that changed everything. An anonymous tip was received by the sheriff's office. A voice, shaky, male, maybe young, said only one thing before hanging up. He's not gone. He's just waiting for the right moment. The call was traced to a payphone on the outskirts of town. The booth had no surveillance nearby, no fingerprints, no witnesses. But there was a feeling among the investigators that the voice hadn't been a prank, that someone, possibly Ethan himself, was finally beginning to speak again. While the detectives combed through evidence and tried to verify the mysterious call, a separate team began reviewing public records for Jonathan Marsh, hoping to find something, anything, that might point to a hidden property, a cabin, a place he could have taken Ethan. They found it buried in an old family trust, an abandoned hunting lodge deep in the woods, passed down from his grandfather and never once mentioned in Jonathan's public life. It was remote, decaying, and long unused on paper. They arrived with a full team, prepared for the worst. But what they found inside was something far stranger than expected. The lodge was in disrepair, but not untouched. Food wrappers less than a year old, a stack of firewood, a dusty blanket that had clearly been used recently, and on the back of a closet door, carved faintly into the wood, was the name Ethan. No last name, no date, just 5 desperate letters that seemed to pulse with history and pain. DNA samples were rushed to the lab. The blanket carried hair fibers that matched Ethan's from school records. He had been there. Recently. The question was, why? Had he returned voluntarily? Was someone helping him all this time? Or was he still being hunted, still trying to stay hidden from a threat that had never truly disappeared? The lodge, it seemed, was another waypoint in a life lived in fragments. Each clue a glimpse into a boy who had grown into a ghost. Meanwhile, Julia began receiving letters. No return address. Each envelope contained a single item, a drawing, a pressed flower, a photograph taken long ago, now carefully folded. These weren't threatening. They were memories, echoes from the past, hand-selected. One drawing showed their old house, with a stick-figure version of Max sitting in front. Another had 2 hands holding each other in front of a lake. Ethan's signature was always there, in small cursive, in the corner. The handwriting had changed, matured, but it was his. It had to be. Each letter reignited the family's pain, but also gave them something they hadn't felt in over a decade. Hope. Not blind, delusional hope, but grounded, fragile belief that Ethan was alive and maybe trying to come home. But why didn't he just walk through the door? Why the riddles, the hiding, the haunting silence? The answer, they feared, was that the danger Ethan fled from in 2002 had never truly been caught. And maybe, just maybe, he believed it still had eyes and ears everywhere. The FBI brought in a psychological profiler to analyze the letters Ethan had sent. According to her, the emotional tone was unmistakable. This was someone who longed for connection but remained trapped in survival mode. The use of childhood imagery, the dog, the lake, the house, was not only nostalgic but strategic. She believed Ethan was trying to measure how much he could trust again, testing the waters before resurfacing fully. "He's watching," she said quietly, "and he's waiting for confirmation that the storm has passed." Meanwhile, authorities dug deeper into Jonathan Marsh's past. A former classmate from his university days came forward, anonymously, with a disturbing recollection. In a therapy session for teachers in training, Jonathan had allegedly described a theory about how trauma could be shaped and controlled in young minds. At the time, it sounded like eccentric academic musing. But now, it read like a manifesto. The investigation expanded into former students, particularly those who had vanished briefly and returned without explanation. Patterns began to emerge, subtle disappearances, withdrawals, sudden transfers. Jonathan had been hiding in plain sight for years. Julia, desperate for answers, returned to the lake trail where Ethan's fort had once stood. She sat alone near the ruins, clutching the last drawing he'd mailed, a boy and a woman, holding hands beneath a crooked tree. As she wept, Max lay beside her, his breathing slow, his face now gray with age. Then, without warning, the old dog lifted his head, ears twitching, nose high in the air. He stood, tail rigid, and began to walk, not run, but with quiet purpose, down a path Julia didn't recognize. She followed, trembling. Max led her deeper into the woods, beyond familiar landmarks, into a space that had once been fenced off after a storm took down several trees. There, hidden behind a collapsed pine, was a small crawl space, a gap beneath twisted roots, half covered in moss. Julia dropped to her knees, reached inside, and pulled out a single object, a plastic lunchbox. Ethan's. Inside, wrapped in a torn t-shirt, was a handheld digital recorder and a stack of photos. Each one was dated, years apart, and in each, Ethan stood slightly older, hidden in a crowd, behind sunglasses, beneath a hoodie, but unmistakably him. The recorder's battery was dead, but Julia clutched it like it was a living thing. Back at home, the forensic team restored the audio. The first seconds were silent, then a breath, and then Ethan's voice. "If you're hearing this, Mom, I need you to know I never stopped watching. I never stopped hoping. But I had to stay away. He said if I came back, someone else would disappear." His voice cracked. "I couldn't risk it. I tried to protect you from him." The recording was over 15 minutes long, and every second felt like a punch to the chest. Ethan spoke in fragments, as though recording over several days. He described moving from place to place, often camping in forests, sleeping in empty cabins, sometimes staying with strangers who never asked questions. He learned how to avoid cameras, how to move undetected. He never stayed in one place too long. "I became invisible," he said, "because it was the only way to feel safe." But then came the most haunting revelation. Ethan confessed that someone had been helping him all along, someone from the community who had once been close to Jonathan, but who had broken away after discovering what he was doing. Ethan never said the name. He only called them the one who knew. This person had given him food, shelter, and occasionally news from town. But in exchange, Ethan had a promise never to return, not until it was truly over. Detectives now had a second mission: identify the one who knew. It was clear this person had risked everything to protect Ethan. But why had they stayed silent for so long? Fear? Guilt? Or something else entirely? The only clue Ethan left was a phrase: "They wore blue on the day I ran, and I saw the terror before the goodbye." It was vague, poetic, possibly a memory burned into a child's mind. Investigators reviewed footage, photos, and reports from the day of Ethan's disappearance, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone in blue who might have shared a painful farewell. In parallel, the photos Ethan left behind were being digitally enhanced. One image, taken at a small fair in a neighboring county, showed him buying cotton candy beside a woman. Her back was turned, but her posture, hair, and height led authorities to a shocking theory. It may have been his third-grade teacher, Ms. Riley. She had resigned a year after Ethan vanished, citing personal reasons. She had moved away, changed her name, and refused all interviews over the years. When investigators finally located her, she was living off-grid, using a different last name. At first, she denied everything. But when they showed her the photos and played Ethan's voice from the recording, her composure cracked. Tears streamed down her face. "He trusted me," she whispered. "He found me after he ran. He begged me not to tell anyone. Said if I did, he'd disappear forever. I couldn't risk it." Her voice trembled as she added, "I thought I was protecting him, but maybe I was just helping him stay hidden when he wanted to be found." Ms. Riley's confession added yet another layer of complexity to the case. She explained how Ethan had shown up at her door late one night, bruised, terrified, and barely able to speak. He didn't ask for help in the traditional sense. He gave her rules. No phones, no doctors, no police. He told me, "If you do anything that makes people look for me, someone else will suffer." At first, she thought he was hallucinating, traumatized. But then he showed her things: notes, photos, recordings. evidence that made her blood run cold. The authorities worked carefully with her to reconstruct the years that followed. She had helped Ethan build a life in shadows, teaching him how to read maps, use cash, and recognize danger. They moved every few months. Sometimes he stayed in shelters, sometimes in nature. Always watching, always listening. Ms. Riley said that Ethan had grown into a quiet, fiercely intelligent teenager who trusted no one but her. And even that trust was conditional. He always carried a packed bag, she said. Everywhere. Every day. What shook the investigators most was Ms. Riley's detailed account of Jonathan Marsh's reach. According to Ethan, Jonathan had contacts, people who looked the other way, who helped him find children without ever leaving fingerprints. He used charm and favors. He used fear, and he operated in the gaps, between programs, between institutions, between the hours when parents thought their kids were safe. Ethan's escape wasn't just from one man. It was from a system that allowed him to exist undetected for so long. As Ms. Riley spoke, Julia sat in a separate room, watching the interview through a screen. Tears streamed down her face. She finally understood the terror that had kept Ethan away for 12 years. He hadn't abandoned her. He had protected her. Every drawing, every coded message, every photo had been a breadcrumb, not just to be found, but to expose the truth. And now, slowly, that truth was unraveling in full view. The pain was unbearable, but it was real. It was honest. It was Ethan. Then came a moment no one expected. Ms. Riley revealed that she had one final item Ethan had given her years ago, sealed in a small wooden box, locked with a combination only he knew. She had kept it buried beneath her garden for years, just in case something ever happened to her. With her hands trembling, she unearthed it and handed it over to authorities. The box was heavy. Inside, a stack of journals and a single Polaroid, newer than all the others. Ethan, standing near a city bus stop, a newspaper in his hand dated just 3 weeks ago. The photo sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Ethan wasn't just alive. He had been within reach. 3 weeks. That meant he was still watching, still moving, still close enough to leave signs if he wanted to. The bus stop in the photo was located in a neighboring city, just 2 hours away. Surveillance footage from the area was pulled immediately. Dozens of hours were reviewed frame by frame. And then, on camera 22, there he was, older, taller, lean, with a hood over his head and a backpack slung across one shoulder. For a fleeting moment, he looked straight into the camera. And in that glance, there was no fear, only calculation. Like he knew the lens was there. Like he was sending a message. Analysts debated whether it was intentional. Some said it was a mistake. But Julia didn't believe that. She believed Ethan wanted to be seen. That he was ready, almost, to come back. But only if he knew the nightmare had ended. Only if he believed the monster no longer had claws in the shadows. The journals from the wooden box were even more revealing. They contained stories, dreams, coded memories. Pages and pages of sketches. Faces, places, feelings. Some were raw, dark, filled with images of running, hiding, crying. But others were peaceful. There was one drawing of Max sleeping under a tree, and beside it, in Ethan's careful handwriting, the words, "When he stops waiting, I will come home." Julia clutched that page to her chest like a lifeline. In one journal, Ethan described a recurring dream, a door that would only open if someone called his name without fear, without sorrow, without expectation. It was symbolic, poetic, and heartbreaking. He had trained himself not to believe in rescue, not to believe in reunion, only in control, only in staying one step ahead. And now, the world that once failed him was chasing him. This time, not to punish, not to question, but to welcome him home. The question was, did he still believe home existed? Investigators placed discreet messages in public places, graffiti with hidden symbols, phrases Ethan used in his journals. Julia recorded a video message, never aired on television, but sent directly to a secure drop channel known only to someone with Ethan's knowledge of the system. It ended with a whisper, "No more monsters. Just you. Just us." Days passed, then weeks. Silence. But then, one night, a light flickered on outside the Torres' home, and Max, now nearly blind, lifted his head and wagged his tail. Julia rushed to the front door, heart pounding in her chest, unable to tell if she was awake or dreaming. The porch light buzzed faintly overhead, casting a golden glow across the steps. No one was there, only the night air and the rhythmic creaking of the old swing chair. But then she noticed something, a small paper bag resting on the welcome mat. Taped to it was a note, short and handwritten. Max still remembers. That means I still can too. Her breath caught. It was Ethan's handwriting. Inside the bag was a single item, a photograph. It showed Julia holding Ethan as a baby, both of them smiling beneath the tree in their backyard. On the back, he had written, "This is the first time I knew what safety felt like." Tears streamed down her face. She collapsed to the floor, clutching the photo, whispering his name like a prayer. She knew it now. He was close, closer than ever. But he still needed time, space, and proof that what he feared no longer had power over his life. Investigators reanalyzed the timeline, focusing on the most recent movements. The trail led to a public library in the neighboring city where the bus photo had been taken. There, a librarian remembered a young man who came in every Thursday, always in a hoodie, always using the same computer terminal near the window. He read poetry, scanned maps, borrowed books on survival and psychology. When shown Ethan's photo, she hesitated, then nodded. He never gave a name, she said, but he looked like he carried the weight of the world. That same night, authorities discovered one more breadcrumb. The computer Ethan had used showed a draft email never sent, just saved. Its title was, "What would it take to come home?" The body of the message was brief. "Can you promise he's really gone? Can you swear the door is still mine?" It wasn't addressed to anyone. No recipient. But it had been left behind, deliberately. The timestamp was from 2 days before the photo had arrived at Julia's door. Ethan had been sending a signal. The FBI began using geofencing and passive tracking to quietly monitor the library area, but with strict orders. No confrontation, no pursuit. Julia insisted that Ethan had to come back by his own will, not because he was cornered. The wrong move could send him running again, maybe forever. And so they waited, and watched, and hoped. Meanwhile, Max began sleeping by the door again, just like he used to in the days after Ethan first vanished, as if he too believed something was about to change. The next Thursday, long before sunrise, Julia stood outside the library. She wasn't there to trap him. She knew better than that. She simply sat on the bench near the window, hands folded, gaze steady, her breath clouding in the morning air. She didn't bring police, didn't call the news. She only brought a thermos of hot chocolate and Max's old leash. It was an offering, a memory, a symbol that said, "You still belong here." The minutes stretched into hours, but she remained silent, patient, and unwavering. Inside, someone sat at the same terminal, hoodie up, back straight. He paused as he noticed her reflection in the glass. He didn't turn, didn't move, just sat there, hands frozen above the keyboard. Julia didn't look directly at him. She stayed still, knowing it had to be his choice. Then, slowly he stood, closed the tap, picked up his bag. He walked to the door, and stopped, inches from the threshold. For the first time in 12 years, mother and son were only a breath apart. He didn't speak, neither did she. But the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. Full of pain, years, longing, guilt, love. Ethan looked older than she remembered, but the shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, it was all there. Julia didn't cry, didn't reach for him. She simply nodded once. He nodded back. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. Not fast, not afraid, just distant. But he had come. He had seen her. And in that silent moment, a door cracked open in both of their hearts. That night, Julia found a second envelope in her mailbox. Inside, a photo of Ethan sitting on a rock by the lake, head bowed, with Max beside him as a pup. On the back, he had written, "I wanted to remember who I was before I forgot." And then, beneath it, 3 more words. "I'm not done." It wasn't goodbye. It wasn't a retreat. It was a promise. Ethan was still healing, still hiding. But now, he wasn't running anymore. Now he was circling back. And for the first time in 12 long years, Julia didn't feel like she was losing her son again. She felt, instead, like she was finally beginning to find him. Piece by piece, step by step, day by day. The ghosts were fading. The silence was breaking. And somewhere out there, Ethan was learning how to become whole again, not just for himself, but for the home that had waited for him all this time. Days passed quietly after Ethan's brief appearance at the library. Julia returned to her routines, though everything now felt laced with anticipation. The house was quieter, but not in a mournful way. It was the silence that comes before a door opens. Max stayed near the window, occasionally perking up when a car drove by. Julia began leaving small notes outside, tucked beneath a rock by the gate. Simple messages like, "We made pancakes today," or "Max had a dream and barked in his sleep." They were pieces of home, waiting for a reply. Then, late one evening, she found a reply. Folded inside a plastic sandwich bag, pinned gently to the wooden fence, was a note in Ethan's matured handwriting. "I remember the pancakes with blueberries. I hated the ones with banana. Max used to wait for mine." It was both heartbreaking and beautiful. He hadn't forgotten. None of it. Not the flavors, not the habits, not the smallest moments that built the life he'd been torn away from. That one sentence said more than 1,000 conversations could. That same week, Julia and the investigators uncovered new evidence about Jonathan Marsh's past. A retired counselor from another town came forward after seeing the case in the news. She described how Marsh had been dismissed from a youth camp 2 decades earlier for inappropriate behavior that had never been formally documented. Back then, the system wasn't built to chase shadows like him. But now, with digital records, facial recognition, and Ethan's recordings, the case was unearthing what years of silence had hidden. A new arrest warrant was issued, this time federal. Marsh, who had disappeared from public view shortly after the story went national, was located in a rental property in another state, living under a false name. When officers broke in, they found evidence that suggested he had been monitoring the media, printing articles, and even attempting to track down Ms. Riley. It was clear now. He knew Ethan had resurfaced, and it terrified him. Because if Ethan spoke publicly, everything would fall apart. Authorities now realized what Ethan had been waiting for all along. He hadn't stayed hidden because he was afraid to be found. He stayed hidden because the man who hunted him was still free. And now that Marsh was in custody, the air felt different. Lighter. Safer. For the first time, the narrative had shifted. Ethan was no longer a lost boy hiding from a predator. He was a survivor who had outmaneuvered the monster and was ready to return, not in fear, but in strength. The morning after Marsh's arrest, Julia opened her front door to find something waiting for her. It wasn't a note this time, but Max's old collar, freshly cleaned, placed on the welcome mat like a gift. Tied to it with twine was a slip of paper. "He can sleep now. So can I." Her knees gave way. She collapsed on the porch steps, clutching the collar against her chest as tears fell freely. It wasn't just a symbol of closure. It was Ethan's first true sign that he was no longer hiding in fear. Word of Marsh's arrest spread quickly. News anchors painted Ethan as a tragic figure, a mystery boy who had outlived evil. But only those closest to the case knew how deliberate, how calculated, and how fiercely intelligent his survival had been. Every step he had taken, from the letters, the photos, the voice recordings, had been part of a long, painful blueprint to stay alive and someday find a way back. And now that path was clearing. The door, once locked by fear, was beginning to open by choice. Julia was invited to speak at a closed press event, not to share details of the case, but to speak directly to families who had missing children. With Max's collar wrapped gently around her wrist, she stepped onto the stage and said, "They're not always gone. Sometimes they're just surviving in silence. And they're listening, always listening, for the moment it's safe to speak." She didn't say Ethan's name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew this wasn't a story of loss. It was a story of endurance. Behind the scenes, the FBI built a confidential witness program around Ethan's journals and evidence. They had uncovered networks connected to Marsh, hinting at a larger, deeply buried ring of exploitation. Ethan, it seemed, had stumbled onto something massive when he was just a child, and had survived not only the trauma, but the burden of knowing too much. He had fled not just from danger, but from becoming a target of those who silenced the truth. And now, he held the key to exposing it all. As Julia prepared for another quiet evening at home, she heard something unfamiliar: a bicycle. She peeked through the curtains. On the sidewalk, leaning against the gate, was an old mountain bike with one pedal missing. She hadn't seen that bike in over a decade. It was Ethan's, the same one he used to ride to practice. No note, no sound, just the bike, and the unmistakable feeling that the boy who once vanished had finally begun to come home. The appearance of Ethan's bike felt like a whisper between past and present, a silent declaration that the boy who had once ridden away in fear was now returning with intention. Julia didn't touch it. She left it right there, leaning gently against the gate, as if disturbing it would somehow disrupt the fragile bridge that was being rebuilt between them. That night, she barely slept. Every creak in the house, every rustle outside stirred her heart with both hope and dread. But the dread was different now. It wasn't fear of losing Ethan again. It was fear of doing something that might delay his full return. 2 days later, Julia heard a soft knock at the back door. It was the same door Ethan had snuck out of so many nights as a child to chase fireflies or bring in Max after dark. Her heart stopped. Slowly, she walked over, hands trembling, and opened it. No one was there. But hanging on the handle was a flannel shirt, Ethan's favorite from when he was 12. The sleeves were now too long, the fabric faded, but the smell of pine clung to it, just like it used to after their camping trips. Folded in the front pocket was a note. I'm not sure how to come home, but I'm trying. It was the first time he had expressed uncertainty, and that, more than anything, confirmed to Julia that he wasn't just circling. He was approaching, slowly, carefully, emotionally bruised, but no longer bleeding. The pain had become part of him, but it no longer controlled him. She wrote him back that same evening. A single page. She placed it under the rock by the fence, like before. You don't have to know how. Just take one step. Then another. I'll meet you wherever you are. Meanwhile, investigators continued piecing together the full scope of Marsh's past. With Ethan's journals, testimony from Ms. Riley, and digital forensics, they began identifying victims across state lines. Some were alive, now adults, with stories they had never told. Others were never found. What Ethan had done, what he had survived, was far greater than personal. His silence had protected others, but his voice now could save them. And the prosecutors knew, when Ethan was ready, the entire country would hear his truth. Then, late one evening, the family's doorbell rang. Julia opened it to find a package on the doormat. Inside was a flash drive. No note, no name, just a small sticker on the device, for her eyes only. Julia locked the door, closed the blinds, and inserted the flash drive into her computer. It contained a single video file, grainy, dimly lit. And then it played. Ethan, sitting in a room with brick walls, candlelight flickering behind him. He looked directly into the lens and said, I'm ready to tell you everything, but only if you still want to hear it. Julia's breath caught in her throat. Ethan's eyes, though older, still carried that same quiet depth she had memorized when he was a child. But there was something new in them now, an edge of maturity shaped by pain, resilience, and long years of solitude. She leaned closer to the screen, not daring to blink. In the video, he continued, this story doesn't start where everyone thinks it does. It doesn't start with the game, or the park, or even with Marsh. It starts with a question I asked myself when I was 10. What happens when the person you're supposed to trust the most becomes the one you fear the most? He spoke in measured phrases, his voice soft, occasionally cracking. He described how Marsh slowly infiltrated his world, first through kindness, then through manipulation, and eventually through control. Ethan revealed how Marsh had isolated him, instilled fear, convinced him that no one would believe him, that telling the truth would only bring danger to his family. I thought I was protecting everyone, Ethan said, but I was just burying myself deeper in silence. His eyes dropped in the video, and for a moment, he said nothing. Then he looked up again. I ran because I had no map for this. I had no guidebook on how to survive monsters who wear masks. I had to build my own. He described his first night alone in the woods, the animals that didn't sleep, the way the darkness stretched into something alive. He described hunger, cold, and the way his thoughts became louder than anything else. But he also described Max. He found me more than once, Ethan said, smiling faintly, even when I didn't want to be found. He just sat there, like he knew I needed someone to still believe I was good. The video lasted over 20 minutes. In it, Ethan detailed his escape routes, the hiding places, the people who helped him without even knowing it. He spoke about Ms. Riley with gratitude, about Julia with reverence. "You never stopped calling my name," he whispered, "even when I stopped answering. That's why I'm still here." And then, toward the end, he made a quiet vow. "If you still want me, I'll come back. I don't know how to be normal. I don't know how to live in light. But I want to try. With you." Julia watched the video twice, then 3 more times. Every word was a thread stitching together a wound she thought would never close. He wasn't just alive. He wasn't just safe. He was ready to return, not as a lost boy needing to be rescued, but as a man who had rescued himself and now wanted to be known, truly known, by the family he had never stopped loving. The next morning, Julia sent a single reply to the drop address Ethan had used. "I've always wanted to hear your story. I want all of it. No edits. No filters. Just you." She didn't expect a quick response. After all, Ethan had lived in shadows for over a decade. But less than 24 hours later, another package arrived. Inside was a small, hand-bound notebook. On the first page, he had written, "This is how I stayed alive. These are the pages that kept me sane." The ink was faded in places, some entries smudged by what looked like water or tears. As she began reading, Julia felt as if she were walking through a forest of Ethan's memories, dense, tangled, and full of whispers. The journal wasn't chronological. Some entries were dated. Others were just thoughts. Some were stories he told himself at night to keep the fear away. Others were vivid recollections of moments no child should ever have to endure. But within it all, there was a clear thread, a deep, aching desire for home. Asterisk, "If they ever find me," one entry read, "I hope they still remember my laugh." He spoke about Max often. He was the only one who didn't ask questions. One page read. He didn't need explanations. He didn't care about the dirt or the smell or the lies. He just loved me. Julia wept as she read those lines, remembering the countless nights Max had slept by the door, his nose twitching at the wind, his tail thumping weakly whenever she whispered Ethan's name into the quiet. Now, those long vigils made sense. Max had always known, somewhere deep in his bones, that Ethan was still out there. One entry was different from the rest. It had no words, just a drawing. A boy, sitting on a ledge, overlooking a valley, his back turned to the viewer. But behind him stood a woman, reaching out, not pulling him back, not pushing him forward, simply reaching. And below, a single sentence, "When I'm ready to stand, I hope you'll still be reaching." Julia held the page against her chest. She was still reaching. Always had been. That afternoon, Julia took the notebook to a small bench outside the old soccer field, where it all began. She placed it gently on the seat, wrapped in a blanket, with Max's collar laid on top. She stayed there until the sun dipped low, watching the empty field breathe with the breeze. When she returned that evening, the blanket was still there, but the notebook was gone. In its place, a single Polaroid. Ethan, standing in the same spot where he had once scored the winning goal. Older now, smiling, not fully but enough. Ethan's reappearance became more deliberate after that day. He no longer left breadcrumbs by accident. Each one was purposeful, a silent communication meant only for his mother. A mug from his childhood, placed gently on the porch railing. A music CD they used to play during car rides, left on the kitchen windowsill. A note inside a sealed bag with a dry pine cone, reading, "I found this on a trail you used to walk when you needed time to think. I followed your steps." It was clear now. He wasn't just finding his way back. He was retracing the life he'd left behind. Julia began preparing his room again, not because she expected him to walk in that night, but because she wanted the space to tell him, this door was never closed. She washed the sheets, opened the blinds, placed new books on the shelf beside the old ones, and hung a small photo of Max above the bed. The room smelled like warmth again. She didn't lock the door. She left it ajar, the way she used to when he was little and afraid of the dark. Meanwhile, Marcia's trial was fast approaching. Prosecutors were building a powerful case, and Ethan's evidence was at the heart of it. Though he hadn't yet agreed to testify in person, the written and recorded materials he had provided were enough to link Marsh to a string of silent victims across 4 states. Several of those victims, now adults, had reached out to Julia through the attorney's office. They didn't want anything, only to say, "Your son gave us the courage to speak. He gave us our voices back." This quiet revolution, the healing sparked by Ethan's decision to survive, spread like ripples in water. His silence had once been a fortress. Now, it was becoming a beacon. Still, Julia knew Ethan's battle wasn't over. Returning home meant facing the pieces of himself that had shattered, the innocence lost, the years buried. But he was no longer alone in that. Every night, Julia wrote him a letter. Not emails. Not texts. Letters. She left them under the tree by the lake, their place. And every few days, one would disappear, sometimes replaced by a pressed flower, sometimes a drawing. One evening, she found something new beneath the tree. A shoebox filled with Polaroids, dozens of them. Ethan, throughout the years, reading, walking, sitting beside rivers, writing in the dark, watching sunsets. Each photo was labeled with a word: hope, learning, stillness. Almost. And at the very bottom of the box, one final image, the front porch of their house. Julia, asleep on the bench, Max curled at her feet, and scribbled on the back, "You were always waiting. I was always watching. I'm almost there." After receiving the shoebox filled with photographs, Julia no longer doubted it. Ethan wasn't just near. He was beginning to re-enter her world piece by piece. Each photo had been taken with care, as if capturing proof that life, even in exile, had still been happening. She stared at the final image, herself and Max asleep on the porch, and realized it had been taken years ago. Ethan had been close, watching, long before she ever knew. The realization brought a strange comfort. He had never truly left. He had just been trying to find a way to come back without breaking everything. The next evening, a new letter appeared under the tree. This time, it wasn't just a message, it was an invitation. "Meet me at the lake. Just you. No questions. No expectations. Just be there." Julia's hands trembled as she folded the note. The lake had been their place, their quiet world away from everything. She didn't hesitate. She packed 2 blankets, a thermos of tea, and the book she used to read him as a boy. And then she waited, standing by the water's edge as the sky shifted from gold to violet. She didn't hear him approach. One moment, she was alone. The next, she felt the air change behind her, warmth, a familiar stillness. She turned slowly. There he was, taller, leaner, his face older, but unmistakably Ethan. His eyes met hers, and for a long time, they just stood there. Words didn't come immediately. They weren't needed. There was too much in the silence already. Years of grief, longing, guilt, and the unwavering bond that had refused to break. Then, finally Ethan spoke. "I didn't know if I was allowed to come back." His voice cracked. Julia stepped forward, tears in her eyes, and said, "You never had to earn it. You were always mine." He collapsed into her arms, and for the first time since he was 11 years old, Ethan let himself be held, not just by his mother, but by the truth that he was no longer lost, no longer hunted, no longer alone. They sat on the blanket together, watching the moon ripple across the lake, not saying much, but saying everything. Ethan didn't go home that night. Not yet. But he stayed longer than he ever had. He told Julia stories, some painful, some strangely beautiful. He asked about the town, about neighbors, about the treehouse they once built. She answered every question gently, letting him guide the rhythm of the moment. When they parted, he kissed her on the forehead and said, "Next time, I'll bring the breakfast." It wasn't a promise. It was a plan. And for Julia, that was more than enough. The days that followed were quiet, tender, full of careful steps. Ethan didn't move back into the house right away. He wasn't ready, and Julia didn't ask him to be. Instead, he stayed in the guest room of a retired teacher who offered her home without questions, someone Ethan had once trusted. He came over for dinners, helped in the garden, sat with Julia on the porch as they watched the wind play with the leaves. There were still moments of silence, of hesitation, of unspoken shadows. But now they faced them together. Ethan eventually visited his old room. He stood in the doorway for a long time, scanning the space as if seeing a museum of a boy he used to be. He touched the bookshelf, the faded trophy on the desk, the blanket that had once covered him after nightmares. And then he sat on the edge of the bed and whispered, "I remember." Julia joined him, sitting quietly by his side. She didn't fill the air with chatter or advice. She simply offered presence. And in that stillness, something inside him began to settle. Max, though slower now, found renewed energy in Ethan's presence. He followed him from room to room, rested his head on Ethan's feet, and wagged his tail even in sleep. Their reunion didn't need ceremony. It was the kind of bond that existed beyond words, forged long ago through loyalty, tears, and the quiet waiting of souls who never stopped believing in each other. Ethan often joked he knew more than anyone, to which Julia always replied, "He never stopped guarding your door." The legal proceedings continued in the background, but Ethan remained protected, his identity shielded. He met with trauma counselors, spoke carefully with federal investigators, and helped build the case that would forever dismantle the dark network Marcia belonged to. For the first time in his life, his voice wasn't just surviving, it was saving. And with every piece of truth he shared, another child's story was given room to be heard. Another silence was broken. And finally, one Sunday morning, Ethan stood in the kitchen, holding a skillet, flipping pancakes, blueberry only, no banana. Julia laughed through tears as he served her a plate and said, "I guess I made it home after all." There were no applause, no cameras, no dramatic ending. Just a mother, a son, and the quiet joy of beginning again. In the background, Max barked softly at the birds outside, and for the first time in 12 long years, the house felt full. Whole. Alive. That Sunday morning marked something subtle, but sacred, the rebirth of ordinary life. It wasn't dramatic, and that was the beauty of it. Ethan sat across from Julia at the breakfast table, watching her spread butter on toast just like she always used to. The sunlight filtered in through the window, warming the wood-paneled kitchen and casting golden stripes across Ethan's face. He didn't flinch. He didn't hide. He just sat in the light, breathing it in as though learning how to live again. They talked about small things. The neighbor's new puppy, a movie playing at the local theater, the fact that Max still preferred to nap in inconvenient places like under the kitchen table. It felt natural, unforced. And for Ethan, these seemingly mundane details were more precious than any grand gesture. He had spent too long in a world of shadows, where every moment was about survival. Now, finally, he was beginning to experience what it meant to simply exist, to laugh, to belong, to be. That afternoon, they walked through town together. Julia had offered her hand, but Ethan gently shook his head. "Not yet," he said softly. "I just need to see how it feels first." She understood. So they walked side by side without touching, and yet the space between them had never felt more connected. As they passed the library, the cafe, the old bus stop, Ethan nodded at familiar landmarks, each one triggering a quiet memory. He didn't speak them aloud, but Julia saw them flash through his eyes. They stopped at the lake again, the place where she'd waited, the place where he had finally appeared. Ethan stood at the edge, watching the water ripple, his reflection dancing in pieces. "I used to wonder," he said, "if the lake remembered me, or if it just kept moving, forgetting everything it touched." Julia didn't rush to answer. She simply said, "It waited, like I did." Ethan looked at her then, eyes wide with emotion, and whispered, "Thank you for not letting go." That evening, he returned to the guest house, but something was different. He left the door slightly open, a gesture Julia recognized immediately. It was the same way she had left his door when he was little, a silent message that said, "You can come in whenever you're ready." And now, he was returning that gesture, not closing off, not shutting down, but leaving a space open, not just in the house, but in his heart. As the weeks unfolded, so did Ethan. Bit by bit, he allowed himself to rejoin the world. He visited the local bookstore and browsed for hours. He rode his old bike down quiet roads at dusk, the wind rushing past him like a whisper of freedom. He helped Julia fix the squeaky screen door, raked leaves from the backyard, and even joined her in baking his favorite cookies, burning the first batch but laughing through it all. Every small act was a stitch in the fabric of his healing. One afternoon, Julia found him sitting on the floor of his old bedroom, sorting through a box of childhood items. A broken action figure, a crayon drawing, a tiny flashlight that no longer worked. He picked up a small rubber dinosaur and said, "I remember hiding this in the vent so no one would take it." Then he laughed. Funny, right? As if a plastic toy was the one thing worth protecting. But Julia shook her head and said, "It wasn't the toy. It was the piece of you it held." Ethan began attending therapy sessions more regularly. At first, he hated them. He said it felt like dragging ghosts out of closets he had nailed shut. But slowly, with patience and trust, he found peace in speaking his pain aloud. He talked about the guilt, the fear, the identity he had shaped around being invisible. And through it, he began to see that survival hadn't made him weak or broken. It had made him resilient, capable, whole in a different, deeper way. He started journaling again, not to survive, but to understand. He wrote about Julia, about Max, about the way the air smelled in autumn and the comfort of his mother's voice humming in the kitchen. He no longer needed to hide these pages. He left them open on his desk, uncensored, unapologetic. His words were no longer whisper confessions. They were declarations of existence, of presence, of life claimed back. Then, on a rainy Saturday afternoon, Ethan did something unexpected. He walked to Julia, handed her a folded paper, and said, "Can you help me get my ID?" She looked at him, surprised, and he smiled. "I'm ready to have a name again. Not just in the past, but now. I want to exist in this world. As me." And with that, the boy who once disappeared without a trace took the first legal step toward reclaiming his identity, not as a victim, but as a man stepping forward, whole and unafraid. The process of reclaiming his identity was more than paperwork. It was symbolic. Each signature, each form, each bureaucratic step was a small act of defiance against the years Ethan had been erased. Julia accompanied him to the government office downtown, quietly standing at his side as he filled out the forms. The clerk, unaware of the full weight behind the task, asked for a current address, and Ethan paused for a moment. Then he looked at Julia and softly said, "Home." For the first time in 12 years, he wrote down the house number he'd been too afraid to remember. After they left the office, the two of them stopped by a small cafe for lunch. It was the same one they used to visit after soccer games, and Ethan recognized the smell of cinnamon rolls before even stepping inside. The barista, a woman in her 30s, greeted them warmly. She didn't recognize Ethan at first, until she caught a glimpse of his eyes. Her smile faded slightly, replaced by a kind of stunned understanding. She didn't say a word. She just nodded gently and slid a warm cookie across the counter toward him. It was free. It was memory. Back home, Julia placed Ethan's new identification card in a small photo frame and set it on the living room shelf beside a picture of him as a child. "One is the boy I lost," she whispered, "and the other is the man I got back." Ethan looked at the two images and nodded, quietly acknowledging how far he had come. He didn't flinch from the reflection anymore. He didn't feel like a ghost inhabiting the life of someone else. He was rebuilding himself, layer by layer, with intention and courage. At night, they started a new tradition. Julia would light a candle on the kitchen table, and Ethan would join her there, sometimes with tea, sometimes in silence, sometimes to talk about everything and nothing. It became their ritual, a space for presence, not performance. One evening, during one of these quiet moments, Ethan said, "I used to light matches just to see something warm in the dark. Now, I don't need to anymore." Julia's hand reached across the table and rested on his. He didn't pull away. And then, on a Wednesday morning, something extraordinary happened. Ethan received his first piece of official mail in over a decade. It was a letter from the court, confirming his testimony had been formally added to the prosecution's case. But more than that, it was addressed to him. His name, Ethan Torres, the boy who vanished, the boy who survived, the man who returned. And in that moment, with the envelope pressed against his chest, Ethan didn't feel like someone whose story had ended. He felt like someone whose story was just beginning. With his name reclaimed and his presence recognized by the world again, Ethan took the next brave step. He asked to visit the school he had once attended. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about confronting the space where his childhood had been interrupted. Julia offered to come with him, but he chose to go alone. She respected his decision. When he arrived, the halls were smaller than he remembered, but the echoes were the same. Sneakers squeaking on tile, lockers slamming, voices rising and falling like waves. He walked past the classroom, where he had once raised his hand to answer questions about dinosaurs and planets. The art room still had murals on the walls, though the colors had faded. He lingered longest near the old gymnasium, the last place he had played before disappearing. The coach on duty didn't recognize him, but when Ethan introduced himself, the man's expression shifted from confusion to quiet awe. "I remember that day," he said softly. "The game, the goal, then the silence." The school counselor invited him to speak, not to the students, but to the faculty. Ethan agreed, cautiously. He stood before a small group of teachers and administrators, most of whom had been hired after he vanished. He spoke not as a victim, but as a voice, a reminder. "Pay attention to the quiet kids," he said. "They're not always okay, just because they don't ask for help." His words were measured, powerful, and deeply human. When he finished, no one clapped, but many wept. News of his visit spread quickly, and soon, Julia received calls and letters from parents in the community, words of love, support, and apologies. One letter came from the mother of Ethan's childhood best friend, who had since moved away. "We thought of him every year," it read. "On his birthday, on the day he vanished. We never stopped praying for him. We never stopped hoping." Ethan read the letter in silence. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in a box labeled "Truths I Can Finally Hold." At night, he began sleeping with the window open. It was a small thing, but after years of living in hidden rooms and sealed spaces, it meant everything. The sound of wind rustling the trees, of life moving freely outside, no longer frightened him. It comforted him. One evening, as he lay staring at the stars, he whispered aloud, "I am still here." And for the first time, the world didn't feel distant when it whispered back. It felt close. It felt his. It felt like home. Autumn arrived slowly, brushing golden fire into the trees and cooling the air that drifted through the open windows of Julia's home. With each falling leaf, Ethan found himself shedding invisible layers of weight he had carried for too long. His daily routines, reading in the sunroom, helping Julia with errands, taking long walks to nowhere in particular, began to feel less like rehearsals and more like real life. The fear that had once governed every decision was quiet now, like an echo that had finally faded into distance. One morning, Ethan sat with Julia at the breakfast table, a notebook open in front of him. "I want to write it all down," he said quietly. "Not just for the court, for me. I want to remember the way it happened. Not just the fear, but the moments of light, too. I want to make sense of it." Julia nodded, her eyes misty. She knew that the act of telling his story on his own terms was more than healing. It was power reclaimed. He began writing that day. His pen didn't stop for hours. The notebook filled quickly. Some days were heavy, others light. One page spoke of hunger and loneliness. The next of joy he felt the first time he saw Julia's face after 12 years. He wrote about Max, about the way silence became company, how stars became guides. He wrote about the teacher who protected him, the strangers who showed kindness, and the darkness he refused to become. His words were raw, poetic, and beautiful. It was not just a story of survival. It was a declaration of existence. As he wrote, the community watched from a distance, gentle and respectful. Neighbors dropped off meals, books, and notes of support. A boy from the neighborhood, no older than Ethan had been when he vanished, left a handmade bracelet at their door with a message, "I'm glad you made it." Ethan wore it for days. It reminded him that the world could still be good, that the cruelty he once knew was not the whole truth of humanity. There was hope, real, living hope. And then, one evening, he looked up from his notebook and said, "I think I want to read this one day, out loud, in front of people, not for attention, for freedom." Julia's heart ached with pride. "You don't owe anyone anything," she said. Ethan smiled. "I know. That's why I want to do it. Because I'm finally choosing to be heard." And in that simple, powerful statement, Ethan took one more step from the shadows. Not as a boy broken by silence, but as a man brave enough to speak his truth. That winter, the town held a quiet event at the community center. Nothing flashy, no press, just those who had known Ethan or followed his story from afar. Chairs were arranged in a circle beneath strings of warm lights, and at the front sat a small wooden podium with a single microphone. Ethan arrived early, holding a slim folder filled with selected pages from his journal. He wore a simple sweater and jeans, but Julia could see it in his posture. This was the strongest she had ever seen him stand. The room was filled with familiar faces, his old third-grade teacher, the local librarian, even a mail carrier who had remembered his birthday every year, even in his absence. They sat quietly, respectfully. Julia stood in the back, her hands clasped over her heart. As Ethan stepped up to the podium, a hush fell across the room. He didn't begin with an introduction. He didn't thank anyone. He just opened the folder, looked up once, and began to read. His voice wavered at first, but steadied with each word. He read about the day he disappeared, the fear that led him into hiding, the confusion of hearing his name on the radio while crouched beneath floorboards. He read about the kindness of strangers, the silence of trees, the smell of rain on cardboard. He spoke of guilt, how it curled inside him like smoke, telling him he had abandoned everyone he loved. And then he read about hope, about Max, about the moment he saw his mother again and felt, for the first time, that maybe he didn't have to run anymore. By the time he finished, the room was silent, not with shock, but with reverence. A silence that held space. For grief. For healing. For him. Then, slowly, someone stood and clapped. Then another. And another. Until the whole room rose to their feet in silent, standing ovation. Not for performance, but for courage. Ethan stood still for a moment, his hands shaking, his eyes wet. Then he stepped down, walked toward Julia, and whispered, "I think I finally came all the way back." Later that night, he stood alone on the porch, watching snow begin to fall for the first time that season. Julia joined him, handing him a warm mug of cocoa. "You were brilliant," she said. Ethan smiled, looking up at the stars barely visible behind the snow clouds. "I was me," he said softly, and with those words, the long winter of his silence began to meld into something new, something soft, steady, and full of the quiet power of a life reclaimed. The morning after the reading, Ethan awoke to a kind of silence he hadn't known before. It wasn't haunted. It wasn't watchful. It was still, safe. The kind of silence that comes only after the storm has fully passed. He sat at the edge of his bed, the sunlight pouring through the window in long ribbons, and for a few minutes just breathed deeply, freely. He didn't reach for the shadows. He didn't listen for imaginary footsteps. He didn't flinch at the sound of the creaking floor. For the first time in over a decade, he allowed himself to simply be. That afternoon, he walked to the town cemetery with Julia. They brought flowers, not for anyone they had known personally, but for the unnamed children buried under stones too small, whose stories had never been told. Ethan placed a small drawing at the base of one grave, two hands reaching through a wall of darkness. "For the ones who didn't make it back," he whispered. Julia stood beside him, silent but present, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "You speak for them now," she said, "and for yourself." Later, Ethan received a call from the district attorney handling Marsh's case. The prosecutor thanked him again, not just for his bravery, but for the clarity and structure of his testimony. "You wrote like someone who has studied pain," the man said, "but also like someone who has learned how to rise from it." Ethan didn't respond right away. When he did, it was simple. "Pain was my teacher, but I choose not to be its student forever." The trial date was approaching, and while Ethan still hadn't decided whether he would testify in person, he felt something new stirring inside: readiness. That evening, he returned to the lake trail where everything had once begun to shift. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink, the wind gentle. He stood at the edge of the water and took a stone from his pocket, a small, smooth one he had carried in his backpack all those years in hiding. He threw it into the lake and watched the ripples spread. "That was the last piece I was still carrying," he whispered, "the one that reminded me who I had to be to survive." It was a quiet letting go, and when he returned home, he didn't stop at the guest house. He walked straight through the front door of Julia's house, hung his jacket by the wall, and sat at the kitchen table. Max's old bed still lay in the corner, now empty, but Ethan looked at it and smiled. "Tell him I'm here," he said softly. Julia didn't have to ask who he meant. She nodded, fighting back tears. The house, once echoing with absence, now pulsed with presence. And Ethan, finally, was no longer a visitor. He was home. As the trial began, the town held its breath. Though much of the case was handled behind closed doors to protect the victims' identities, everyone knew that something long hidden was finally being dragged into the light. Ethan, after much deliberation, chose to attend. Not to speak, not at first, but to watch. To see Marsh with his own eyes, not as a shadow haunting his past, but as a man bound by truth, stripped of power. Julia sat beside him in the courtroom, her hand in his, her strength wrapped around his like armor. Marsh looked older, smaller, and yet still unervingly calm. When Ethan entered, Marsh's eyes scanned the room but didn't seem to recognize him at first. And then, when their gazes met, there was a flicker, a flash of something Ethan couldn't define. Not dominance, not control, but fear. And in that moment, Ethan knew he had won. Not through revenge, not through rage, but by refusing to be broken, by living, by healing, by choosing presence over disappearance. He held his head high and didn't look away. The testimony from other survivors followed. Ethan listened, his chest tight with empathy and rage. Stories like his, others even worse. And yet, within them, there was also a quiet, collective strength. Each voice added weight to the truth that had once been buried. Ethan knew then that his story was not just his own. It belonged to a larger chorus, one that would echo long after the trial ended. When asked if he would testify after all, Ethan nodded. Not for him, he said. For them. For us. On the day of his testimony, the room was silent as Ethan stepped forward. He spoke clearly, deliberately, not rehearsed, but real. He told the court about the manipulation, the terror, the calculated silence he had endured. But he also told them about Max, about Julia, about the light that had waited for him. You took years from me, he said, his eyes locked on Marsh. But you didn't take me. I'm still here. And that means you lost. His words didn't shake. His hands didn't tremble. He walked back to his seat with the calm of someone who had found his truth and spoken it aloud. After the testimony, Julia wrapped him in a hug so strong it nearly took his breath away. The courtroom remained hushed, reverent. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft and silent. Ethan stepped into it with his coat open and his face turned upward. He was no longer hiding from the cold. He was walking straight through it. And with every step, he left behind the boy who had vanished and walked forward as the man who had returned. When the verdict came, it wasn't dramatic. It was firm. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom didn't erupt into cheers. Instead, there was a silence deeper than applause. A silence of justice finally speaking. Survivors wept quietly. Some held hands. Others stared ahead, still processing the reality that their voices had mattered. Ethan didn't cry. He simply exhaled. A breath that had been trapped in his lungs for 12 long years. A breath that said, "It's over." Julia sat beside him, her eyes shimmering. "You did it," she whispered. But Ethan shook his head gently. "We did it." He looked around the room at the faces of people who had endured so much and chosen to keep living anyway. They were no longer shadows. They were warriors. Survivors. Each one carrying scars that now held the weight of testimony, not just trauma. Marsh would never walk free again, but more importantly, none of them would ever have to carry his silence again. Outside the courthouse, the snow had settled into a soft blanket. Reporters stood at a distance, careful not to intrude. Julia placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and asked, "Ready to go home?" He nodded, but as they began to walk, he stopped, then turned to the crowd of survivors behind him. One by one, he embraced them. Some were strangers. Others had shared rooms and hidden shelters, places where words were whispers and memories were kept behind locked eyes. Now, they were holding each other with the strength of being seen. That night, Ethan slept deeply. No nightmares. No locked doors. No flashlight tucked beneath his pillow. He dreamed of the lake, of Max barking in the distance, of his childhood home glowing with warm windows and the smell of cinnamon. In the dream, he was neither hiding nor running. He was walking slowly toward the porch where Julia sat waiting, a cup of cocoa in her hand. She smiled, and he sat beside her. The dream didn't need words. It was peace. The next morning, he woke up and opened his window to the morning frost. The world looked bright, clean, alive. He stood in front of the mirror and looked into his own eyes, not to see if he still resembled the boy who vanished, but to meet the man he had become. "You're here," he said to his reflection. And for the first time, he believed it. Spring arrived slowly but surely. The snow melted into streams that trickled down the sidewalks, and trees once brittle with winter began to breathe again. So did Ethan. He began volunteering at the library, first shelving books, then quietly leading a creative writing group for teens. He didn't mention his past. He didn't need to. His calm presence, the way he listened, the way he never interrupted when someone paused too long, said everything. One girl left a note on the whiteboard. "You make it feel okay to be quiet. Thank you." Julia, now back to her painting, began leaving canvases out for Ethan. He never called himself an artist, but she noticed how he stood longer by the window now, watching light move across the floor. He began sketching again. Not darkness, but light. People holding hands. Trees growing through cracks. Small cabins filled with lanterns. One day, he placed a new drawing on the fridge. A house on a hill, with lights on in every window and smoke curling warmly from the chimney. On the roof sat a boy and a dog, both looking up at the stars. He eventually published his journal, anonymously, with only the dedication signed, to the boy who vanished and the man who came back for him. The book reached people across the country. Letters arrived at Julia's door. Mothers, teachers, even foster children writing to say, "I didn't think anyone understood until I read this." Ethan answered each letter personally, sometimes just with a line, sometimes with pages, but always with care, always with presence. He knew what it meant to be answered. One evening, he and Julia sat by the lake again, this time in silence, watching ducks drift lazily across the water. "What do you think your life would have been if it hadn't happened?" she asked gently. Ethan thought for a moment, then smiled. "I don't know, but I think, even if I'd stayed, I wouldn't have learned what I know now." He looked at her and added, "I wouldn't have known how deep love really goes, or how strong someone has to be to wait without knowing." As the sun set, painting the lake in shades of gold, Ethan stood and stretched. "Come on," he said, extending his hand to Julia. "Let's go home." And this time, as they walked together through the soft light of evening, there was no need to look back, no need to wait for a sign. The boy who had vanished in fear had returned in full. And now, he wasn't just part of the world again. He was a light within it, quiet, steady, and unforgettable. Sometimes, the greatest stories are not the ones filled with noise, but the ones that unfold in silence, where every moment of pain carries a seed of strength, and every step through darkness brings us closer to light. Ethan's journey wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming identity, rebuilding trust, and proving that even when someone disappears, hope doesn't have to. Through each year of silence, each hidden message, and each fragile return, he taught us that healing is not a single moment. It's 1,000 small choices to keep moving forward, even when no one is watching. This story reminded us that home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a person, sometimes it's a memory, and sometimes it's a promise we make to ourselves that we'll keep going until we feel safe enough to return. Julia never gave up on that promise. She waited, not with desperation, but with quiet faith. And in doing so, she became the lighthouse that guided her son back, not through force or fear, but through presence, through love, through unwavering belief that he was never too far gone. Ethan didn't return because he was rescued. He returned because he was finally free to stop surviving and start living. He faced a man who once silenced him and spoke louder through action than words ever could. And in that choice, he gave others permission to rise, to speak, to remember that no monster, no shadow, no silence can define who we are, unless we let it. His journey was proof that the human spirit is not fragile. It bends, it breaks, but it also rebuilds itself stronger than before. As the seasons turned, and life slowly stitched itself back together, Ethan left behind more than pain. He left behind a path, a reminder that if you're lost, it's never too late to be found. If you're waiting, your love might be the only thing keeping someone tethered to hope. And if you've survived, your story might be the very thing that helps someone else believe they can too. Because sometimes, just being here is the bravest thing a person can do. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. Who might be waiting for you to reach out? Who needs to know they're not forgotten? And if Ethan's journey gave you hope, let that hope grow. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what really matters. Like, share, or leave a comment telling us what part of this story stayed with you. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.